The following is a scientific hypothesis and solution set that other people are welcome to test and scientifically validate. Part C, Oswald and Tippett, Smoke and Mirrors. 7 days after Oswald's birth, a declaration of birth in Louisiana was signed by Uncle Harvey F. Oswald. The baby's actual name might have been Cameron Forbes Payne. One of LBJ's buddies, Korth, handled the 1948 divorce of one Marguerite Oswald. Ruth Hyde requested info on Lee Harvey Oswald's family in 1957, and she married Michael Payne in December 1957. Ziger, a Polish Jew, perhaps previously had fled to Argentina. On May Day 1960, the day of the U-2 power spy plane incident, and the day Oswald was seen in both Minsk with black hair and in Moscow, he tells Alec to go home to the USA. Alec was introduced to Marina 10 months later after he still had not returned to the USA. On January 20, 1961, in New Orleans, 10 Ford pickup trucks were purchased by Hispanic Joseph Walton Moore and by Oswald, who was the one with the money. Around January 1962, Alec in the Soviet Union wrote Robert Oswald, whom he may never have met previously. "You wouldn't have any clippings from the November 1959 newspapers of Fort Worth, would you? I'm beginning to get interested in just what they did say about me and my trip here. The information might come in handy when I get back. I would hate to come back completely unprepared." Cameron might have been the Oswald in Mexico, but Bishop Phillips circulated a picture of some random guy around November 18th to prevent Cameron from being identified. Michael Payne helped Lee move the iron pipes into the Irving garage in September 1963. Cameron Forbes Payne was always Cameron Payne, but he played the part of Lee Oswald for 12 to 18 years as a youngster and as a young adult. Cameron and Michael were Ruth Forbes' alleged two sons, who both looked a little like Alec. Roscoe Anthony White served in the Marines with Cameron in 1957. Roscoe received orders to join the department, Dallas Police, in September '63 to prepare for his next assignment, the elimination of a national security threat to world peace. Mrs. Roscoe White had a third rifle pose picture in her possession. She said her husband had told her it would be very valuable one day. In late September 1963, Richard K. Snagel shot the ceiling of a bank to avoid being complicit. In 1974, he said under oath that he had been ordered to arrow the Patsy. On November 9, Igor Vaganov, or Cameron, calling himself Oswald, test drove a red Mercury Comet 70 miles per hour and said he would be able to buy in cash in a couple weeks. During the lunch hour on November 22, Michael Payne was discussing assassins with a co-worker at Bell Helicopter, and when he heard Alec had been captured with a gun, he remarked, "Stupid blankety blank, he is not even supposed to have a gun." The owner of the other Dallas school book depository was a Nazi racist, Russ Carlson. Before the JFK lunch setting and route had been published, this was an alternative triangulation of crossfire site. At 12:29, the Hertz clock first shot was maybe from Mac Wallace, Texas School Book Depository, 6th floor, with a rifle, but there was a tree in the way, and it might have been a blank cartridge. The second shot was maybe Roscoe from the grassy knoll with a rifle, and it was the JFK neck wound and windshield, and Roscoe might have been Badgeman. The third shot was maybe Charles Harrelson, one of the Tramp impersonators, from the Dow Tex building, 6th floor, with a rifle. The fourth floor maybe was Mertz, aka Sutre, from County Records building with a rifle, and it hit Teague at the overpass. The fifth shot was maybe Charles Rogers, one of the Tramp impersonators, from the Dow Tex building, 3rd floor, with a pistol, and it caused a back wound. Maybe the 6th final frangible kill shot was Roscoe from the grassy knoll with a rifle. At 12:31, Billy and maybe Alec seen on the Texas School Book Depository steps. At 12:35, Billy, Buell, and Shelley take off to the railroad tracks, maybe to grab the grassy knoll rifle, then enter back of the Texas School Book Depository owned by D.H. Bird. At 12:40, after grabbing the sixth-floor rifle, Ozzie, Lee, or Billy come out the rear of the Texas School Book Depository, get in Payne's station wagon, or very similar, with Carl Mather's license plate, PE 3435, and Hispanic Joseph Walton Moore is maybe driving. He was the CIA Dallas Domestic Contact Officer. Could have been Moore and Billy, or Gordon Novel, in a look-alike car to assure that Cameron and Michael wouldn't talk. At 12:44, an APP is put out, maybe on the new and unofficial Channel 3, describing Alec's size and build, sort of. At 12:50, Payne's station wagon is seen at a 4340 West Davis service station with a shotgun in the back seat. At 12:52, Tippett is watching the Trinity River Viaduct as Alec passed. At 12:54, Tippett is at 8th and Lancaster. People saw Tippett or Weissman sitting in a car for 10 minutes. At 1 o'clock, a plainclothes police honk at Alec's boarding room, then drove away. Maybe Tippett dropped off Alec at the theater? The Top 10 record store is 1 block from the theater. Then Tippett drove to McRaven's location where Vaganoff was ready for the ambush. At 1:05, Alec enters the Texas Theater, owned by Nevada CIA Director Howard Hughes. At 1:06, both Ozzie Lee and Billy make scampers separately from Oak Cliff to the theater, one of them via the Jefferson Library. At 1:07, Tippett stops in front of Ann McRaven's house, 404 10th Street, and when he's coming out of the house, Tippett was maybe shot by a rifle by Igor from a distance. Zukowski calls Senator Thomas Dodd's juvenile probation branch in Conroe, Texas at 3:35 p.m. The FBI suspected Vaganoff might have had something to do with Tippett's death. He was in the U.S. Navy from 1959 to July 13, 1963. Vaganoff was at the Henry Olson Safe House, or girlfriend's location, until 12:30. Heard the news. Vaganoff left Sunset Apartments from 12:50 to 2:15, then returned and toured the Tippett and Kennedy murder scenes with Ann Zukowski till 3. At 4, FBI agents Hall and Abernathy showed up to interview him. At 1:10, Jack Ruby leaves the Dallas Morning News. 3 ambulances report Code 5 on Channel 1. At 1:13, Alec in the theater balcony buys a bag of popcorn on the main floor and either goes back upstairs or onto the main floor of the theater. At 1:15, Dr. Richard LaCoria at Methodist Hospital pronounces Tippett dead. Was Vaganoff seen in a long coat escaping the scene in a '62 Plymouth coupe? Mrs. Tippett was crying during the morning. Later on, she received $7,500 in insurance and $600,000 in donations. On December 23rd, she had a car accident incident, but there were no casualties. At 1:28, Rubenstein was seen at Parkland Hospital. At 1:35, Lee and or Billy ducked in through the front of the theater. The other went up the fire escape and was let in. The unidentified pregnant woman went up to the balcony and disappeared. Gerald Hill might have opened the balcony fire exit door. At 1:36, CIA front shoe store man Johnny Brewer called for an alert that suspect had entered the theater. At 1:42, Rubenstein appeared at the Carousel Club. Oklahoma Associated Press Bureau Chief at 1:45, Wilbur Martin, sitting in the front row, informed Patrolman McDonald where Alec was sitting. At 1:49, Billy was arrested in a white shirt in the balcony. He was winded from the scamper, was brought down the outside stairs, was driven away in the back alley by police, was never charged, and was brought to Lavelle's office, room 317. At 1:51, Alec was arrested in the third row from the rear, main floor, was taken out the front, was booed and hissed at like Jesus, on cue, and was booked. Why am I being arrested? The only thing I have done is carry a pistol in a movie. The plan maybe was to shoot him when he ran, but he didn't. At 1:56, Billy watched the DPD when Alec arrived and was brought into the building. At 2:02, Lee was seen in a white t-shirt and a red Ford Falcon, also with Carl Mather's license plate, switched cars in the last half hour, in the El Chico parking lot behind T.F. White's garage just north of the theater. At 2:05, Rubenstein calls his sister Eva from an unknown location. Ruth Hyde Payne, in the late afternoon, said to the detectives, "No search warrant? That's fine. Come on in." There was also a Marguerite altercation about money, money, money. Marguerite had called the Fort Worth Telegram and Bob Schiffer, and they brought her to Dallas. Around 2 a.m. the next morning, Henry N. Olson and his girlfriend had a meeting with Ruby. Part D. Bobby and LBJ, DPD, blackmail by police, by women, liking liars, and by some Jews. Bobby Kennedy was planning to expose LBJ's criminal activity in a Life article that was never published. JFK was planning to drop LBJ from the 1964 presidential ticket and replace him with Terry Sanford. The modus operandi of most women, of J. Edgar Hoover, and of some Jews possibly is to blackmail people as an effective course of action. Most of the Warren Commission's positive witnesses were maybe being bribed or blackmailed in some way or another by the DPD or by others. Officer Jefferson Davis Tippett's wallet was maybe planted as Alec Janso Heidel's wallet. The Jews were expelled from Great Britain in 1290 and from Nuremberg, Germany in 1499. The Catholic Nazi or Jew Pew charitable trusts started in 1948, the same year Israel became a country. There is also a Woodward Foundation, but there was no Gulf of Tonkin incident. The following is a scientific hypothesis and solution set that other people are welcome to test and scientifically validate. Part E, Oliver Stone and the Jews in Daltex, Zapruder and Luce Auditorium, 1978, 15 years later. There were a lot of Jews occupying the Daltex building in 1963. David Weisblatt, Morty Friedman, Russian Jew Sam Bronfman, who owned Seagram's, Zapruder, and the Dallas Uranium and Oil Company. Zapruder filmed the assassination. Immediately he sold it to Henry Luce for $150,000. It was developed at Kodak Dallas, and then it was altered at a CIA facility in Rochester, New York on Saturday or Sunday night. There were possibly 4 Zapruder films made, 1 original and 3 copies. Edgar and Edith Sulzberger Stern of the Wall Street Journal and Sears Roebuck were friends of Clay Shaw and owners of the WDSU station that ransacked Garrison's case in 1967. You shall not circulate a false report. Exodus 23:1. i.e. from the Warren Commission. There were a few performances I attended at Henry and Claire Luce Auditorium, Dumaguete, Philippines in 1978, but I didn't know the Luces would crop up again later in my life. Was my dad a 1954 periodic CIA agent with extra pay and tasks? I don't think that thought really occurred to me until a couple of months or days ago. It might not be accurate. Lots of people go to Albuquerque, the Bahamas, Montreal, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Heilbronn, and Honolulu, don't they? Then again, my mom was bright-eyed and sprightly 5 days before her organs started shutting down, and she died 3 years ago. It sounds a little like a biological warfare hit to me. She was cremated, no autopsy. The JFK movie was directed by a Jew in 1991. On the heels of Carpenter's They Live movie in 1988. to be an awesomely plotted and executed movie that blames a lot of people, but silently tries to throw the scent off of any Jews. Part F, Fear and Trembling, and the Composite Man. The birth of the Talking Oswald Evangelical Church might have started on July 12, 1484, with Georgus Helmstetter. On June 27, 1528, Dr. Georg Faustus von Heidelberg, Faust, from Helmstadt near Heidelberg, was a trickster and fraud who joined the new Protestant movement. In 1600, the Jewish Pappenheimer witch trials took place a little further east in Bavaria. Some poor itinerants, not named Pappenheimer nor Pappenheim, were scapegoated as the cause of all sorts of unsolved crimes and other problems, and were disgustingly vilified by the good Christian prosecutors and townspeople. Marguerite Oswald once commented she used to read Ulysses with my friend Pappenheimer, now at Harvard, and I had been a student at the University of Heidelberg. Possibly Michael Paine's legitimate or illegitimate birth was the cause of the Great Depression, so the family made a Celtic sacrifice to the gods. W. Giles Thomas appears to be some sort of fake marriage to Ruth Forbes in the early 1940s. George Lyman Payne Jr. buried Sutton Island, Maine, and Ruth Forbes married in 1926. The divorce date is fluctuating. Francis Drake Payne headstone on Sutton Island, Maine, 1912 to 1999, is probably Margaret Forbes, with a homage to Brit Sir Francis Drake. Ruth Forbes' brother William Hathaway married Anne Pappenheimer on 12/31/1935. Is she also buried in Maine? Francis Drake Payne, aka Freddie or Freddie, lived 1911 to 1999 and appears to have had some sort of fake marriage to Michael Payne's dad, George Lyman Payne Jr. George divorced Ruth in 1934. George Lyman divorced in 1934 because Margaret was pregnant and needed a husband. Margaret became Francis Drake Payne to give birth to Cameron Forbes Payne, or Lee. The now shunned trust was formed on May 2nd, 1932. John Edward Pick, the name he had always gone by, probably had a New York, now shunned, Boston, or Maine dad. John Pick never saw his father, Edward John Pick, an Albert Jenner question. John lived at 325 East 92nd Street, Manhattan. Rodman Clark Rockefeller lived 1932 to 2000. John Edward Pick lived 1932 to 2000. In a young three-boy Oswald photo, John looks like the 45 Margaret with Mr. Ekdahl. John learned from a Life magazine article that Ed and Marguerite were separated when he was born and divorced later in 32 or in 33, was told his real dad was a railroad porter and former pro basketball player. John Pick's live-in dad, when he was 2 years old, Marguerite's second husband, was called Lee Oswald. In 1952 in New Orleans, there were two sets of Marguerite Oswalds and kids living in nearby neighborhoods. There was a 5'0" Margaret living with a Lee Oswald character. There was also a 5'6" Margaret living with a Robert Oswald kid, and perhaps with a Cameron Forbes, aka Lee kid. The 5'6" Marguerite might have visited her son John at 325 East 92nd Street in Manhattan in August 1952. However, she was maybe pretending to be the 5'0" Marguerite in order to frame her in the future. John later said he didn't feel a motherly love towards the 5'0" Marguerite, but that is probably because the 5'6" Marguerite was his real mom. As mentioned previously, the 5'0" Marguerite might have been Margaret Emma Keating. When 5'6" Marguerite and her son Cameron, Lee, visited in August, John had a cheerful meeting with his real younger brother. John lived at his mother-in-law's apartment with his wife Margaret or Marjorie Dorothy Furman, birthday December 21 or 22, 1933, who was one of 7 kids. Marguerite made a comment that John was better than his wife. This would maybe be a comment that a Forbes, Cabot, now Shun Island daughter would make. Furman could also be an alias. Any chance that John married one of the former Hungarian president's daughters? After a staged argument, Marguerite got kicked out of the apartment. John re-enlisted and he and his wife moved to Portsmouth, Virginia to live with John's wife's sister, Emma Parrish. John said, "My wife liked Lee. It would be nice if Lee would stay with us alone and we wouldn't mind having him." Any chance Marguerite left Lee with John and his wife and headed back to New Orleans by herself? 6 years later, in 1958, John and Robert had another argument with a Marguerite Oswald, this time in Fort Worth, Texas. John then left for service work in Japan. Was Lee with him? And he said he never saw Marguerite again. Switching gears, there's a Jewish story about Abraham deciding to sacrifice or kill his son Isaac. Kierkegaard did an extremely in-depth analysis of this story in Fear and Trembling. It's not that far of a stretch to suggest that Fear and Trembling could have been taught in German universities such as Heidelberg in the 1920s, though Kierkegaard is not responsible for the JFK assassination. Philosophers don't kill people, guns do. Did Ruth Forbes Payne Young give up Cameron to the Mafia, who was replaced with a Genesis 2213 Ram or Scape Sheep, Alec, whom Jack Ruby killed? Or was Margaret Forbes, mother of Cameron and sister of Ruth, likewise given to the Mafia, where she took a role as a New Orleans CIA Avon and shoe salesperson? Would June Oswald, not born in June, legally be a merging of the Mafia and Forbes families? Or else would it be an arrangement where the CIA and or the Mafia protect the Forbes and other people like them? Blackmail is a Scottish word that means protection from pillage. Lee Harvey Oswald is a composite man. Robert Lamont Chase, Manhattan Bank, had a wife named Mary who wrote a 1944 play called Harvey about a giant make-believe bunny. There was also a 1927 cartoon called Ozzie Rabbit, which was Cameron's Lee's nickname. Oswald has an English origin that means God rule. Os, Latin for mouth, and wald for wield authority. Don't confuse Oswald with Orwell. How many fingers am I holding up? Lee is also English, sheltered or protection. Lee Cameron became chosen to play a part in the Scape Sheep plot. Governor Connolly was Secretary of the Navy in '61. Then Fred Korth was, who was a lawyer in Marguerite's 48 Ekdahl divorce as Francis Drake. There's an unidentifiable park picture in New York that could be the Minsk Oswald, but he is not the one Rubinstein shot. Or is he? Is Bruno Mancuso the doctor who delivered Cameron? Robert and Cameron probably had a New Orleans dad, or maybe just Cameron, or maybe neither. Why in 1956 does the New Orleans City Directory list both Marguerite Oswald and Margaret Keating, both living at 120 North Telemachus, both former wives of Robert E. L. Oswald, a wedding on 11/1/1920 with no kids? Both sides of Michael Payne's family, Cabot and Forbes, owned land in Cuba that was expropriated by Fidel Castro. Those damn commies. Any chance Nelson Rockefeller impregnated Ruth, bore Michael, who flunked out of Harvard in '49? Any chance Nelson impregnated Margaret, who bore John? Any chance Nelson impregnated Polly, who bore Robert Heidel? Is Frances Drake Payne Margaret Forbes? Is Cameron Forbes Payne Lee, whose dad is Nelson or some other New Yorker? Cameron said on 12/27/1963 that he lived in New York City from 1941 to 47. He did not see much of his father, even though he also lived there. John Foster Dulles, brother of Allen, contracted the 99-year United Fruit Company of Boston's Cabot and Cabot Guatemalan arrangement in 1936. Nelson Rockefeller was sworn in as President Eisenhower's special assistant in charge of super-secret Cold War strategy and psychological warfare in December 1954. He announced his candidacy for the Republican presidential nomination on August 10, 1963. The Brazilian Institute of Democratic Action was funded in part by Cabot, Cabot & Cabot's First National Bank of Boston in the fall of 1963. Alwyn Max Pappenheimer Jr. of Cedarhurst, New York, died at an unknown location, was the son of an unknown father and unknown mother, was the husband of Pauline Forbes, married in 1937, at an unknown location with unknown children. Anne H. for Hathaway Miller Payne is Cameron's wife and is also buried in Maine, or is Anne H. Miller an alias for Anne Pappenheimer? Alwyn Pappenheimer is Anne's dad. Polly married Alwyn legitimately in 37. Big age difference, maybe more legal marriage than loving. Did Pauline Forbes Pappenheimer have a daughter? Not Vada Oswald? Yes, Anne Pappenheimer or Anne Miller? Did some Jewish Bavarian Pappenheimers change their name to Rockefeller? There is also a Mary, mother of Jesus, Pauline Forbes Johnson, from Boston and from Maine, adopted by Harriet and Harriet. Polly Forbes' daughter? The online genealogy indicates this poor person is related to the stories. I smile inwardly quite a bit when I read about myself. I smile and say, oh goodness, how can you be so wrong? Marguerite Frances Claverie and Ed John Pick were married on 8/1/1929 in Harrison County, Mississippi. Both Senator Ford and Robert Oswald experienced uneasiness when Michael Paine was taking an oath to tell the truth, or when Robert received a weak, distant eyes, fish-like handshake. According to John Pick, well, sir, the Lee Harvey Oswald I met in November of 1962 was not the Lee Harvey Oswald I had known 10 years previous. Ever since he was born, and I was old enough to remember, I always had a feeling that some great tragedy was going to strike Lee in some way or other. Cameron Forbes Payne is Lee Oswald. Alec, the man Ruby shot, is the Wicker Man, 1973 movie. The most spiritual aspects of the case. If you research the life of Jesus Christ, you find that you never did hear anything more about the mother of Jesus, Mary, after he was crucified, said 5'0" Marguerite. He died in the service of his country. My son, Lee Harvey Oswald, even after his death, had done more for his country than any other living human being. John Pick, speaking of the 5'0" Marguerite, John, who is a Forbes, whose God is money. All she cared about was getting hold of and making some money. This is her God, so to speak, was to get money, and to get as much out of me as she could. Marguerite married Edward Pick 8/1/1929, shortly before Polly was 17. Did Marguerite begin at a New Orleans law firm shortly before she was 17, or are the stories being mixed and matched? Ed Pick did not want children and would not support her. He supported John until he was 18. He tried to fulfill his responsibilities and obligations dutifully. Marguerite and first husband divorced amicably after a year on Genoese Street. Margaret was very pretty and had a very happy childhood. Nelson Rockefeller, VP under Gerald Ford, was 3 years younger than Margaret Forbes and 3 years older than Pauline Forbes. Maybe Pauline helped Sister Margaret with her pregnancy, and then Margaret also helped Pauline with hers. My sister was taking care of Lee permanently, from age 2 to 5, at 831 Pauline Street. A question was later asked to 5'0" Marguerite. Do you think your sister, they said this to my sister, do you think that your sister has hallucinations? Nelson Rockefeller destroyed Frida Kahlo's friend's Diego Rivera's Rockefeller Center mural in 1934 for being too socialist and too anti-capitalistic. His son, Michael Rockefeller, disappeared or was eaten by cannibals in 1961. Mary Todd Hunter put up with Nelson Rockefeller's illegitimate children living separate lives until she finally got a divorce in 1962. Nelson married younger, happy Margaretta Murphy on May 4, 1963. Nelson Rockefeller died in 1979 at age 70, when I was living in the Philippine Islands, in the company of 25-year-old Megan Marshak at a townhouse on 54th Street, Manhattan. It's possible Nelson is my dad's hero. He's 93 now, but he used to say he wanted to die when he was 70. This presentation on how long United States citizens will be prevented from seeing the remainder of all of the JFK assassination classified files is a matter of national security. It is a serious matter of the security of the people in this nation who have all the money. Plus all of the fiduciary assets hidden in Switzerland and in Panama and in the Bahamas, e.g. Deltec holdings, that are difficult to detect, hidden in legal but fraudulent trusts. Get a Job LLC was founded in 2017 on the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution and on the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's 95 Theses, to help combat the lethargic assimilation and acceptance of contemporary religious language. Just Another Holy Book was composed in my parents' basement and in my Lamar's apartment between 1996 and 2006. It notably addresses, directly or indirectly, transparency, ethics, justice, righteousness, and the contemporary social contract, if any, between people and society. On April 6, 2018, I wrote a note on my apartment refrigerator about making it easy for people to bring the JAHB pages to church. JAHB The Hazy Beginning comprises sections 1, 2, and 3, History, Poetry, Piety. JAHB Theoretical Matches comprises sections 4, 5, and 6, Folly and Iniquity, Prophecy, Philosophy. And JAHB The Inviting In comprises sections 9, 10, 11, and 12, Sapiency, Probity, Purity, Beauty, of the 12 JAHB sections. These sections were completed at various stages in 2006 or before, when I was living in my hometown of Lamar's, Iowa. Sections 7 and 8 of Just Another Holy Book, The Fog Starts to Lift, were completed in 1997. Did you get a job yet? Everyone who enjoys living in the United States of America is complicit in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, including me. I try not to enjoy myself too much. Hopefully this presentation will not be too incendiary, in order that some billionaires might reluctantly be persuaded that maybe it's the right time to move on by putting away the smoke and mirrors. Presumably most of these same people will not be persuaded, but even so. The following is a scientific hypothesis that other people are welcome to test and scientifically validate. Part A. William Harvey, John Thomas Mason, and the Cabana Motor Hotel. There was a JFK assassination plot set for Chicago at a December 7 Army-Navy game, but the plot was revealed, so it was done 15 days earlier. The plans were already in place, just had to switch the locale and some details. LBJ proposed the Dallas trip. John Thomas Mason was a Dallas arms seller who appears to have been involved, and William Harvey might have been the organizer. A number of dangerous characters were staying at the Cabana Motor Hotel on November 21st. Morgan Brown, Eugene Brading, or James Braden, Lawrence Myers, Gene Acey, aka Gene West, A.A.C. There is also a possibility that Sutre was in the vicinity. Part B. H.W. Bush, the CIA, and Thomas Dodd. Aristotle Onassis made his first million selling opium to Argentina. Then he made a deal with Meyer Lansky and Joseph Kennedy to ship prohibition alcohol to Boston. Dusan Popov gave intelligence about a possible Pearl Harbor attack as early as August 12, 1941. But J. Edgar Hoover went into a tirade and refused to pass the information to the White House. Adolf Cheppy Weidenbach was from Heidelberg. Marguerite Oswald said, "I had been a student at the University of Heidelberg." Was Alec Janso Heidelberg a Russian-speaking student there in the late 1950s? Anyway, Mr. Cheppy changed his name to Charles Willoughby, became a friend of Allen Dulles, and was MacArthur's World War II intelligence chief. Apparently, there was a CIA OSS terror network formed after World War II to attack leftist groups, an ultra-rightist network that included Billy James Hargis, Fire and Brimstone, H.L. Hunt, and CIA Edward Hunter. Hungary's Ferenc Nagy lived in Dallas and might have been involved with Permidex and Centro Mondial Comercial. In June 1946, Nagy received permission to return $52 million in gold that Hitler took from Hungary. On 5/28/47, Nagy's family settled onto a 120-acre farm outside of Herndon, Virginia, after he resigned his Basel post. The Secret National Security Act of 1947 might have related to Kenneth Arnold's 9 disc-shaped objects, but they might have just been rudimentary satellites in the atmosphere. Oil-powered? Satellite means attendant. Per Jack White, David Phillips or Morris Bishop and Marguerite Oswald lived in the same New Orleans neighborhood, and she loaned the identity of her youngest son to the U.S. government for a small monthly payment. Mahatma Gandhi was shot dead on 1/30/48. Also in 1948, Eisenhower became president of Columbia University. Nagy's banker was Schroeder, might be J. Henry Schroeder, Bank of America. Was Michael Payne's uncle Eric Schroeder possibly the same person? Eric was on the dresser board with Prescott Bush. Both the Tolstoy Foundation, Paul Regorodsky, and the Russian Orthodox Church received CIA subsidies. Was Scamway also a CIA front company in 1959? And who was in Stanley, North Dakota in 1953? Alec or someone else? Thomas Dodd, dad of Chris Dodd, was on a Senate committee related to juvenile delinquency. Charles Cabell and Robert Mayhew might have assisted Howard Hughes in his donation of an island for the no-name group mercenaries. JFK planned to exterminate the Federal Reserve. Woodrow Wilson warned against this invisible, organized, subtle organization. Perry Russo told of a triangulation of Crossfire meeting and of the participants' plans to be out of town. He also was unable to identify a person at that meeting as being the person whom Jack Rubenstein killed. His name possibly was Cameron. A man named Veciana, Morris Bishop, and possibly Cameron met in a Dallas cafe around Labor Day 1963. H.W. Bush ran the Fort Worth CIA office and was the top CIA in Dallas on November 22nd. The purpose of Israel and the CIA is to prevent democracies in countries. First of all, to prevent democracy in the USA, and also to prevent democracy from taking shape in other countries such as Peru, Argentina, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and the Congo. There is, of course, a possibility, not a certainty, that W. Bush was related in a similar way to the 9/11 attacks.